Nymphomaniacs have always existed. As a result, there is no single precise way to date the origins of nymphomania in human history. But we will try to get as near to it as possible while also investigating how nymphomaniacs have been treated over time. One thing is certain. At the end of this thought-provoking video, you'll know the diabolical sad history of nymphomania and how to identify a nymphomaniac and what to do with her if you ever encounter one. The 18th century gave rise to the relatively modern idea of nymphomania, a term historically used to characterize excessive sexual desire among women. Exploring prehistoric communities, however, reveals intriguing facets of gender roles and sexual activity. The main priorities during the prehistoric era were reproduction and survival. There was not the same understanding of intimate desire that there is today. Sexual behavior was probably motivated more by biological urges than by pleasure or personal desire. Some insight into archaic ideas about female sexuality can be gained from the Venus figurines, which are little statues from the Paleolithic period. These sculptures, which are distributed throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa, show women with heightened sexual attributes, implying a significant focus on procreation and fertility. It's crucial to remember that these artifacts can just represent the value of reproduction and fertility in these communities rather than pointing to a primordial kind of nymphomania. It's crucial to take into account the social structures that prevailed at the time. The majority of prehistoric cultures were probably egalitarian, meaning there were no rigid social classes or hierarchies, and this most likely included intimate relationships as well. There is further proof of prehistoric sexual conduct in the archaeological record. Sexual practices are frequently shown in cave paintings and other prehistoric artwork, implying that sex was a commonplace activity. Even though the evidence for references to nymphomaniac women in prehistoric times is scant to non-existent, I still have a gut feeling that something is there, so we need to delve farther. Greece in the past. The word nymphomania comes from Greek mythology, namely from the nymphs, who were little goddesses connected to the natural world. The nymphs, who were frequently depicted as youthful maidens who enjoyed dancing and singing, were renowned for their beauty and free-spirited character. However, they were gods, not mortals. The sexual conduct of a simple Greek lady was strictly supervised and controlled. Any deviation from the standard was attributed to divine intervention. It was expected of women to be modest and to engage in minimal intimate activity. It was thought that their extreme intimate desire was a sign of moral weakness. Greek society developed a complicated and frequently contradictory concept of women's sexuality as a result of this belief and the medical beliefs. We should surely look at the ancient Greek medical views on nymphomania because, to be honest, they sound more like something from a horror film. One theory that became rather popular was the idea of the wandering womb. This hypothesis, which is mainly credited to the Greek physician Hippocrates, said that a misplaced uterus was the cause of many health issues that women faced, including excessive sexual behavior. It was recommended that one alter their diet or take bed rest in order to treat a wandering womb. If that was still ineffective, more drastic steps were implemented. Consider fumigation. In order to force the womb back into its right location, fumigation entailed applying unpleasant-smelling chemicals to the nose and pleasant-smelling ones to the vagina. Whoa! The extremely skilled physicians of ancient Greece also recommended marriage and childbearing as additional cures. As late as the 16th century, the wandering womb idea was still taught in European medical schools due to its profound influence on medical thought. The hypothesis was only seriously questioned and subsequently dismissed from the medical field with the advancement of modern anatomy and the cutting open of human bodies. The term hysteria, which comes from the Greek word for uterus, was also accepted by the ancient Greeks. This was a medical illness that was thought to only affect women and was brought on by uterine abnormalities. Hysteria symptoms included trepidation, lightheadedness, and above all, atypical sexual conduct. A copy of the Kama Sutra ought to have been sent to the ancient Greeks by someone. Issue resolved. It is quite likely that the Kama Sutra was composed in 225 AD. If you have a fun fact, go surprise your friend with it. Medieval times. Even though the situation was clarified by the ancient Greeks, it seems necessary to go further into the background of these bizarre magical creatures known as nymphomaniacs, and where better to explore next than the shadowy Middle Ages, where one never knows what insane humping might be going on around every corner. The Middle Ages saw mental health very differently than it does now, and the theories of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, who thought that women's bodies were inherently wetter and colder than men's, making them more affected to certain conditions, greatly influenced the understanding of nymphomania. For example, it was believed that they were more susceptible to illnesses, including respiratory disorders, some types of fever, and increased sexual desire that are linked to an excess of cold and dampness. The four humors theory, which postulated that the human body was made up of four fundamental substances, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was the theoretical foundation for this idea. It was thought that a person's health and temperament were determined by the balance of these chemicals, which were connected to the four elements of earth: fire, water, air, and air. This belief held that women's bodies were inherently colder and wetter because they were believed to be dominated by the colder and wetter humors, phlegm and black bile. Doctors frequently recommended therapies like hot baths and certain herbal medications that try to warm and dry the body. This idea, along with social norms around women's conduct, resulted in the development of the nymphomania diagnosis. Throughout the Middle Ages, there was disagreement about the best ways to treat nymphomania. While some doctors advised marriage and frequent sex, others advocated for more drastic procedures like bloodletting or surgery. But don't fall for it. The overly healthy bathtub treatments were only affordable for upper-class women, and lower-class women who displayed excessive sexual desire or behavior similar to what we would now consider to be nymphomania were viewed with suspicion and frequently subjected to harsh punishments. Nymphomania was not widely accepted during the Middle Ages. The Church, which had a big say in what society accepted, saw this kind of activity as wicked and a danger to society's moral foundation. Penalties, public humiliation was the main form of punishment, and it was frequently used in the Middle Ages for a variety of offenses. Women who were accused of engaging in excessive sexual conduct were frequently paraded through the streets in their undies, where they were ridiculed and mocked by their peers. A deterrent effect of this public humiliation was that it discouraged others from repeating the same actions. In more extreme situations, women were committed to asylums and treated horribly there. Among these was bloodletting, which was then a popular medical procedure thought to balance the body's humors. As previously stated, the goal was to remove any extra blood that was believed to be the source of the patient's hypersexuality. In the Middle Ages, there was one more penalty for nymphomania, but let's just leave it at that since, to be honest, I'm not even sure I can reveal it on YouTube. The diagnosis of nymphomania served as a social control mechanism in addition to reflecting the state of medicine at the time. Many women repressed their sexual urges out of fear of cruel treatment and public humiliation, which fueled a culture of silence and repression surrounding female sexuality. These conventions were furthered by the Church's influence, which linked sexual desire to immorality and sin. These medieval practices were not without their detractors. Texts from the era, particularly those authored by female mystics like Marjorie Kempe and Julian of Norwich, subtly critiqued the Church's views on female sexuality. They proposed that women's sexual yearnings were not intrinsically evil, but rather could be a conduit to spiritual awakening. To this, I echo a resounding Amen. Now let's turn our attention to Marguerite de Bourgogne, the infamous French queen of the Middle Ages, whose notorious sexual escapades made her one of the era's most talked about women. Marguerite's existence at the royal court was far from typical. She was celebrated for her allure and charisma, yet her licentious conduct was equally well known. Her voracious, intimate desires led to a string of liaisons that left the court and the entire realm in shock. Marguerite wielded her influence skillfully, gaining sway over numerous courtiers and nobles, thereby cementing her authority within the court. Nonetheless, her erotic adventures were far from secret. Her actions were deemed outrageous and immoral by the standards of the day. Yet Marguerite was unapologetic about her passions. The equilibrium of her life was disrupted when she became embroiled in the notorious Tour de Nesle scandal in 1314. This controversy implicated the daughters-in-law of Philip IV of France, including Marguerite. They faced allegations of infidelity leveled by their own spouses. The Tour de Nesle, a tower in Paris, was rumored to be the site of these illicit encounters. The scandal erupted following the discovery of a purse containing keepsakes thought to be gifts from the women's paramours. Marguerite was specifically accused of engaging in an affair with a knight, Gauthier d'Aunay. This affair had profound repercussions for the French monarchy, culminating in the execution of d'Aunay and his brother, as well as the incarceration of the implicated women. The repercussions of the Tour de Nesle scandal were immediate and severe. Marguerite de Bourgogne, convicted of adultery, faced life imprisonment. Her noble birth offered no protection against the severe judgment meted out by the court. Deprived of her titles and privileges, she was confined to the formidable Château Gaillard in Normandy. The conditions of her incarceration were a stark contrast to her previous regal life, offering little comfort and leading to the decline of her once lustrous beauty and health. Marguerite's decade-long imprisonment ended in 1325 with her enigmatic demise. While some speculate that she was murdered, others believe she may have taken her own life. Despite the tragic conclusion, the essence of her story is found in the joy she embodied. The famed French queen perpetuated the enduring allure of nymphomania. While some may view this as a curse rather than a blessing, it remains a topic open to debate. The term nymphomania emerged in the 18th century, signaling the pathologization of women's intimate desires. During this era, the medical community began to define and diagnose various conditions, including those pertaining to sexuality. The French doctor Bienville, who coined the term, labeled nymphomania as a disorder marked by an uncontrollable craving for intimate activity, which he saw as an abnormality in female sexuality. The criteria for nymphomania were not scientifically grounded, but were instead based on subjective assessments and societal morals. The symptoms ranged from coquettish behavior to an intense yearning for sexual fulfillment, and even the reading of novels, which were thought to corrupt women's minds. The label of nymphomania served to suppress and stigmatize women who strayed from the expected norms of sexual modesty and inactivity. It is crucial to recognize that the concept of nymphomania was deeply entrenched in the social fabric of the 18th century. Women's roles were predominantly domestic, and their main purpose was viewed as childbearing. Any display of intimate desire by women outside the confines of matrimony and child-rearing was met with skepticism and condemnation. The idea of nymphomania extended beyond the realm of medicine, influencing the arts and literature emerging in the 18th century. Catherine the Great of Russia, often regarded as history's most infamous nymphomaniac, reportedly had an insatiable appetite for lovers, leading to the alleged murder of her spouse to make room for her romantic escapades. Her notoriety extended to a clandestine chamber decorated with erotic furnishings where she entertained her numerous consorts. Her persona could be likened to the Russian equivalent of Dorian Gray during that era. The concept of nymphomania gained further traction with the advent of psychiatry in the 19th century. Psychiatrists such as Richard von Krafft-Ebing and Sigmund Freud castigated women's sexual urges, denouncing them as hysteria or nymphomania. Freud in particular was known for his peculiar and controversial theories on the subject. He posited the penis envy hypothesis, suggesting that any manifestation of a woman's intimate desire beyond the confines of wedlock and childbearing was met with skepticism and condemnation. The stigma surrounding nymphomania permeated beyond medical circles, influencing the arts and literature of the period, thereby perpetuating cultural clichés about women's sexuality. In the 19th century, the field of psychiatry bolstered the diagnosis of nymphomania. Figures like Richard von Krafft-Ebing and Sigmund Freud were notorious for their disparaging views on female libido, equating it to conditions such as hysteria or nymphomania. Freud's theories, particularly outlandish, included notions like penis envy, where he argued that during developmental stages, a girl's realization of her anatomical differences from males could lead to feelings of inadequacy and resentment. He also coined the Electra complex, describing a daughter's competitive feelings towards her mother for her father's attention, which he believed could culminate in nymphomania. It's crucial to recognize that Freud's ideas were met with skepticism and debate, often seen as reflective of his personal prejudices rather than empirical observations about female sexuality. Nonetheless, Freud's unique perspective and unconventional theories remain a topic of discussion. The 19th century witnessed the emergence of peculiar theories regarding nymphomania, presenting a seemingly liberating perspective for women who were perceived as overly sexual. Initially, medical hypotheses took center stage. The degeneration theory posited that some individuals and lineages were inherently prone to mental and physical deterioration. This notion was frequently invoked to account for nymphomania, casting women with this diagnosis as morally corrupt and disruptive to societal harmony. Concurrently, neurasthenia was identified, marked by extreme fatigue and debility, with many doctors considering it a consequence of women's heightened sexual appetites, thereby associating nymphomania with mental disorders.
However, when it seemed that women's plight would persist, several dissenters emerged, questioning the medical and societal perceptions of female sexuality. A faction of medical professionals contended that nymphomania wasn't an ailment, but rather a natural fluctuation in sexual yearning. They criticized the baseless and culturally relative standards that defined the term and its use as a means to pathologize and regulate female sexuality. They also highlighted the hypocrisy in societal attitudes toward male and female sexual behaviors. While women were labeled nymphomaniacs for their robust sexual desires, men faced no such scrutiny for comparable conduct. This hypocrisy mirrored the era's gender expectations, which characterized male sexuality as dominant and assertive, and female sexuality as passive and yielding, creating a clash between societal norms and personal inclinations. Despite these objections, the label of nymphomania persisted well into the 20th century. By the time the 20th century rolled around, perceptions of women's sexuality began to shift. The Kinsey reports of 1948 and 1953 contested prevailing beliefs, revealing that women's sexual appetites were much more diverse and fervent than once assumed. Nonetheless, nymphomania lingered in the lexicon, often used derisively to describe women who were sexually active. The 1950s also marked the increase in lobotomy procedures to address various mental health issues, including nymphomania. This drastic measure, which entailed inflicting damage to the brain's frontal lobes, was deemed a desperate remedy for nymphomania. Thankfully, the method was contentious and frequently resulted in significant adverse effects. Reflecting on the fact that merely 7 decades ago, society legally sanctioned such invasive treatments on some of the most remarkable individuals is disheartening. In the 1960s and 70s, the feminist movement began to critically examine the notion of nymphomania. Feminist theorists argued that the term served to medicalize women's sexuality and fortify patriarchal dominance. They underscored the absence of a male counterpart to the term, spotlighting the double standards in cultural perspectives on male and female sexuality. The necessity of such a term remains questionable. In the closing decades of the 20th century, perceptions of nymphomania underwent a transformation. The label became increasingly regarded as archaic and discriminatory, falling out of favor in clinical discourse. It was reminiscent of an era marked by miscomprehension and censure of female sexuality. As the 21st century dawned, references to nymphomania virtually vanished from medical texts. The era ushered in a progressive understanding of female sexual health, with the World Health Organization advocating for a constructive view of human sexuality, emphasizing the right to enjoyable and secure sexual experiences. This represented a significant departure from earlier views that pathologized women's sexual appetites. During this time, the study of sexology made considerable progress in demystifying female sexuality. Research illuminated the intricate and varied nature of women's sexual yearnings, debunking oversimplified past beliefs. The notion of nymphomania as a pathological condition became increasingly incongruous with contemporary insights into female sexuality. Fast forward to 2024, and medical professionals have largely replaced the term nymphomania with hypersexuality. Hypersexuality is identified by an overwhelming prevalence of sexual thoughts or behaviors that disrupt one's life and cause profound distress. Its origins are diverse, with biological aspects like hormonal imbalances or neurological disorders potentially triggering hypersexuality. Psychological contributors such as mood disorders, substance misuse, and certain personality disorders are also implicated. Contrary to the common belief that hypersexuality equates to a high libido, it is, in reality, far more intricate. It involves an uncontrollable urge for sexual activity that can result in distress and functional difficulties in everyday life. It is not about the enjoyment of sex, but rather the inability to regulate sexual urges. Another misconception is that hypersexuality is a voluntary condition, which can lead to unwarranted blame and judgment of those affected. However, hypersexuality is not a matter of choice, but rather a complex interaction of biological, psychological, and societal influences. These misunderstandings can lead to serious repercussions, deterring individuals from seeking assistance, intensifying feelings of shame and guilt, and reinforcing damaging stereotypes. It is vital to confront these misconceptions and foster a more empathetic and accurate comprehension of hypersexuality. It is essential to support and accept individuals dealing with this condition. Present-day physicians perceive hypersexuality not as a moral defect or character flaw, but as a multifaceted interplay of factors that, if neglected, can have grave consequences. Unaddressed, it may result in relational strife, occupational challenges, legal complications, and health hazards. Despite this knowledge, there is a lingering fear that seeking help could result in extreme measures. In reality, treatment typically comprises psychotherapy, medication, and self-help methods. It is crucial for those experiencing hypersexuality to pursue professional guidance. And for those interested in learning more, our documentaries provide further insight. Although only a couple are displayed, our channel page offers a broader selection. We invite viewers to suggest topics for future documentaries in the comments and to engage with our channel through likes and subscriptions.